Good morning. My name's Di Brown. I'm a Chartered Accountant and Business Advisor with SRJ Walker Wayland. Today, I'll be taking you through the 10 key steps to start a successful not-for-profit organisation. So my passion is education and educating businesses and organisations on the importance of planning for success and working with you to develop strategies broken down into detailed action items to ensure you achieve your growth and sustainability goals. So today I will be taking you through the 10 key steps to setting up a new not-for-profit organisation. So we will go through each of the 10 steps, and at the end of the PowerPoint you will see that I have listed a detailed list of resources that I would suggest you go through and make yourself familiar with before you start establishing your not-for-profit entity. So before we start on the 10 key steps, let's talk about what a not-for-profit actually is. A not-for-profit organisation is simply an entity that doesn't operate for profit, personal gain, or the benefit of its members. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't make a profit. In fact, you want to make a profit. Rather, that profit is simply reinvested to further the aims of the organisation and ensure its success and longevity. There are two types of not-for-profit organisations. The first category is a charity, which is registered under the Charities Act 2013 and governed under the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission, which we refer to as the ACNC. The second category are other not-for-profits that aren't members of ACNC or registered charities, and these are things like sporting and recreational clubs, community and other service organisations. As well as a not-for-profit, we hear about the term social enterprise. And I have a lot of people that come to me and say they want to set up a social enterprise, but what does that really mean? It's important to understand that a social enterprise is not a legally recognised classification. It's simply a business that is designed to achieve a particular social outcome through commercial means, such as selling their goods or services. The social outcomes that the social enterprise want to achieve might be economic, social, cultural or environmental, but they're outcomes that are consistent with the public interest. A social enterprise can actually be both a not-for-profit or a for-profit entity. The general rule with respect to social enterprises is that they reinvest a minimum of 50% of the profit towards achieving their identified social purpose. And there are some examples of social enterprises in actions. There are a lot of trading cooperatives, and there are organisations that deliver or distribute profit to particular social causes. So before you consider starting a not-for-profit organisation, you need to do your research. And you need to firstly consider, do you want to be a formal or an informal organisation? And when you're considering these approaches, you need to be asking yourself, what is the core purpose of your group? What is the focus of the work that you will actually be undertaking through that particular organisation or group? And are there any other existing community groups that do the same work as you? Bearing in mind that currently in Australia there are over 700,000 registered community groups that are in action as we speak. You need to make sure that you are engaging with the peak bodies that cover your area of interest. Once you've done that, you need to define what your group will look like. Is it simply a group of volunteers, in which case you'll still need to consider the organisation of the volunteers, the management, or do you want to be a more formal organisation and have paid staff? You need to think about the activities that your group will actually undertake and what resources you are actually going to need to be able to perform the service that you want to do. I can't stress enough how important it is to seek professional advice early in establishing a not-for-profit to ensure that you have your structure and your setup correct from day one. So in terms of structure, you need to consider whether you are going to be an unincorporated or an incorporated organisation. So an unincorporated association is not a separate legal entity from its members. So what that means is that every member in that organisation has legal liability for any of the actions that are conducted by the group and any debts that are incurred by that group. An unincorporated association is set up for a common purpose. It cannot enter contracts in its own name, which means it can't employ staff, it can't lease premises in its own right. It can still register as a charity if it's conducting charitable acts, and some strong examples of this are usually religious communities, animal welfare groups, cultural welfare groups, etc. So if you decide to think about incorporating, there are some advantages associated with that. If you are an incorporated not-for-profit, and there are a number of different ways you can go about incorporating, and I'll come to those in a minute, but the key advantages of incorporating your not-for-profit entity are that it gives you limited legal liability because the incorporated entity is seen as a separate legal entity. So the members aren't individually liable. It can enter into contracts in its own right, so it can purchase assets, it can borrow funds, it can lease premises, it can employ staff, it can apply for grant funding. It can also achieve deductible gift recipient status, which is tax benefits available to people who donate to that relevant organisation. And it allows for perpetual succession, whereby if your membership base changes, the entity still exists. Issues you need to consider when deciding whether to incorporate or not. Costs and time. If you are going to incorporate, there is a requirement to have formal meetings, maintain proper financial records. There is public information that is available through various means. You need to think about the risk of the activities that you are actually considering to be undertaking and any other future activities that you're going to undertake. There are specific activities, depending on the nature of your not-for-profit, that must be incorporated. So if you're considering any activities around housing, aged care, or native title, then you must set up as an incorporated not-for-profit entity. So assuming you've decided you're going to go down the incorporated route, there are 4 different structures you can consider. One is an incorporated association. One is a company limited by a guarantee. The third one is a non-trading or non-distributing cooperative. And the fourth one is an Indigenous Corporation. The most common of these incorporated not-for-profit entities are the first 2. So I'll focus mainly on those areas, although I will do a quick recap on the other types of entities as well. So the first entity we look at is an incorporated association. An incorporated association is governed by the Associations and Corporations Act of 1981. A couple of key things to bear in mind. It is a separate legal entity. It must have a minimum of 7 members, and each incorporated association has its own state laws because they are state-based legislation, which can make it difficult if you're considering trading outside of Queensland, although you can still register with ASIC under the Corporations Act or the relevant Associations Incorporation Act in the other states you're considering trading. They have model rules that you must follow, which are referred to as the association's constitution. You must have a management committee with a minimum of 3 members on that committee. Your financial statements must be adopted at an annual general meeting, and they may require audit or further verification depending on the size of the entity. An annual return must also be lodged with the Office of Fair Trading. So more importantly, let's look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of becoming an incorporated association. So who would we recommend establish themselves as a not-for-profit through this type of structure. If you are a local Queensland-focused not-for-profit or community group, you might want to consider this entity. It's recommended if you want limited capacity, if you have limited capacity, to meet some of the more extensive reporting obligations that exist, for instance, under some of the other relevant acts that you might be required to comply with under some of the other types of structures. It's not suitable from groups from interstate or groups that are considering operating nationally or across other states or territories. You can do it, but it's a little bit more complicated. And I would suggest another type of structure if you're planning on operating outside of Queensland. And again, you need a minimum of 7 members. The second type of most commonly used organisation in the not-for-profit world is a company limited by guarantee. This one is governed by the Corporations Act 2001. So there are much more stringent reporting and compliance requirements if you are set up or established as this particular entity. So it's regulated by ASIC unless you are a registered charity, and then you're regulated by the ACNC. You can operate anywhere in Australia, you have limited liability, and there are 3 different tiers of reporting depending on the size of your not-for-profit organisation. Your reporting and audit requirements, again, are based on your turnover. However, if you're a small not-for-profit, certainly in the startup phase, there's no auditory requirement. If you decide to go down the registered charity path, you will also be governed and required to report to the ACNC, the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission. And if you are thinking of obtaining deductible gift recipient status, again, you will require no matter on what your turnover level is, you will be required to provide financial statements and audits to the relevant governing bodies. You must have a company constitution, and there are penalties for non-compliance with reporting requirements, and the director's duty, because you're governed under the Corporations Act, is more strictly enforced and more onerous. So let's look at who we would recommend set up as a company limited by guarantee. If you're planning on becoming a larger not-for-profit, this is probably the most appropriate structure for you. If you're planning on trading interstate or nationally, again, most appropriate structure. Bearing in mind, it's not suitable because of the extra compliance and regulatory burdens, it mightn't be suitable for a charity that's planning to operate just in Queensland on a smaller basis. So you need to think about the future of your not-for-profit in determining which is the most appropriate structure for you. The third type is what we call a cooperative organisation, which is governed under the Cooperatives National Act. It's regulated by the Queensland Office of Fair Trading, and if you decide to register as a charity, you're also required to comply with the ACNC rules. There are 2 different types, distributing or a trading co-op or a non-trading co-op, and the principles are set out in the Act regarding your membership, your control, your independence, education of the members, training and information. There's a whole lot of information contained in that Act that you need to comply with. So generally speaking, a trading co-op tends to operate in the agricultural, retail, transport, water and wholesale trade industries. And non-trading co-ops exist in the accommodation and hospitality, arts and recreation, education, training, healthcare, housing and social services industries. So who would we recommend use this entity for? I guess it's where each member is willing to share in the investment and the operational risks. So for example, if you're thinking of setting up an art cooperative, or a ski lodge through a cooperative, or a childcare group to provide members, who will only provide its services to members of that particular co-op, then this might be a structure you want to consider. It's probably not great or not an appropriate structure for groups that want to benefit a wider range of people than just the members. Or if you want to have different voting rights associated with the levels of membership. The final structure that you can have as a not-for-profit is for an Indigenous corporation. So again, there's some specific rules around this. You're governed under a different act. You must register, you comply with the Register of Indigenous Corporations. It is a separate legal entity. You can be a not-for-profit or a for-profit organisation. If it's a not-for-profit, it must have the rule book that prevents profit being distributed to members, and that rule book will incorporate your Indigenous customs and traditions. So again, to use this entity, you actually must be an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander group. And it must also be used by those holding or managing native title under the Native Title Act of 1993. So in the not-for-profit world, as I said at the beginning, the most common types of organisations you might want to consider will be an incorporated association or a company limited by guarantee. So once you've decided on whether you're going to be an incorporated or an unincorporated association, you need to determine whether you want to register as a charity. So if you register as a charity, you're governed under the Charities Act. You must, not everyone can register, but it's pretty broad. So there are 12 charitable acts or charitable purposes, which are broken down into 3 key areas. So charitable purposes that advance health, education, religion, culture or social or public welfare, charitable acts that promote or protect human rights, or other purposes that are beneficial to the public. And if you go and have a look at those 12 charitable purposes, there's 14 subtypes that exist within those. So if you are a registered charity, you must comply with the ACNC, Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission, governance standards and reporting requirements, which means you need to lodge an annual information statement. You can be eligible for tax concessions then, and you may be eligible to apply to the ATO for deductible gift recipient status. If you are considering becoming a charity, you need to be working closely with a lawyer and your accountant to ensure that your constitution has the appropriate charitable purpose clause. And again, if you're considering going down the deductible gift recipient status, that you have the specific DGR revocation clause in your constitution. So there are some additional legal requirements that you need to comply with if you are considering becoming a charity. So let's look at some of the reasons that you might want to register a charity. The main benefit is it gives you access to more tax concessions and therefore access to incentives and in some cases additional funding streams. There are a lot of grant funding programs that are only available to registered charities and also that are only available to deductible gift recipients. It tends to give you a higher profile and a more credible reputation in the community because people tend to feel safer because your information is publicly available. You must comply with ACNC governance standards, and because you have then, in compliance with those standards, the right to use the ACNC charity tick logo. It does have simpler, if you are going down the incorporated association or even the unincorporated association structure route and you're not complying with the corporations law, there is simpler reporting requirements than if you're going down a company limited by guarantee. So what are some of the additional obligations that you also need to consider? Well, firstly, you need to think about your requirement to comply with ACNC's governance standards. You need to ensure that you have responsible persons who are willing to be listed on the public register for responsible persons that are linked to that charity. You may have additional reporting or even duplicate reporting requirements because of the different acts and different reporting governance areas that will come with being a registered charity. So determine in step 4 whether you want to go down both the charity and the deductible gift recipient status. And you can do one or the other. You don't have to do both. And in fact, a lot of charities will simply become registered charities with ACNC without going to that next step of becoming a deductible gift recipient status organisation through the Australian Taxation Office. So once you've decided on your charity registration, you need to ensure that you are aware of your governance and director duty requirements. And there's 4 main legal duties for your committee members that you need to comply with. The first of those is that your committee members have a duty to act in good faith in the best interests of the organisation and for a proper purpose, that you act with reasonable care, skill and diligence, including the duty to prevent your organisation trading insolvently. You have a duty not to improperly use the information or your position as a committee member of that organisation. You have a duty to disclose and manage any potential conflicts of interest. So they are 4 key duties that you need to understand and be familiar with if you are considering being a committee member of a not-for-profit organisation. Other governance and legal duties you need to comply with include your record keeping, your requirement to hold an AGM, your reporting requirements, which will be determined based on your structure, as discussed earlier, and also knowing what other laws you need to comply with. So there is legislation that you need to be familiar with and how it applies to you with respect to your workplace health and safety, with respect to anti-discrimination laws, with respect to fundraising laws, with respect to working with children checks, with respect to privacy laws, and with respect to negligence and defamation laws. So there is a raft of laws that, regardless of what type of not-for-profit you're considering setting up, that you should be getting yourself familiar with. Then you need to ensure you have appropriate registrations, licenses and insurances. So at the very least, you're going to need an ABN and a tax file number. You don't need to register for GST as a not-for-profit unless your turnover is expected to exceeds, $150,000. If you are employing staff, you need to be complying with pay-as-you-go withholding rules, your super choice legislation, remitting your superannuation guarantee contributions as they're due, comply with your relevant workplace health and safety legislation. And more importantly, you need to ensure that you have registered your appropriate organisation's business name, that you have considered whether there is any IP requirements or intellectual property registrations required, such as trademarks. If you are planning on trademarking your logo, for example, you need to be looking at that. You also need to ensure that you have your domain name registered, which will secure your website address. So don't forget that, because that's an important step. Then you need to think about what level of insurance do you want or do you need? At very minimum, you're going to need public liability insurance. If you have staff, you're going to need workers' compensation insurance. You're going to need volunteer personal accident insurance. You'll probably need public liability, well, you will need public liability insurance, I've already said that, professional liability insurance, directors and officers or management association liability insurance, in addition to your general business insurance that around your business assets and motor vehicles, etc. So again, seek help early to ensure that you have yourself protected in terms of insurance coverage. You need to ensure that you've got your record keeping and your accounting system set up correctly. So your ATO requirements are that you keep your records preferably in electronic format for 5 years, starting from when the record was obtained or the transaction is completed, whichever date occurs first. ACNC, however, requires you to keep records of your financial and operational systems for 7 years. So you need to use the 7 years in this situation. Set up your integrated systems. So get a cloud-based accounting software program that can link into all of your other relevant modules. So Xero and MyOb are two fantastic ones. They can be linked to something like Receipt Bank, which will allow you to simply take photos of all of your expenses and your receipts, have it uploaded directly encoded into your Xero accounting file. So it's a great system. You need to be thinking about a customer relationship management system or volunteer management system and how that will integrate with your relevant accounting system. One of the other things that's really important as a not-for-profit is that you develop and document your systems and processes and policies. And there's some great templates that are available on the ACNC website to assist you with doing that. And I've put a link up there for you to consider. There's also a free, fantastic Queensland-based service called the Injury Prevention and Management Program, IPAM. It's run by the state government. It's a free system that's available to assist you to get your workplace health and safety systems in place. I would suggest you make use of that IPAM availability in the initial setup phase to help you ensure that you're covered with what you need to do to comply with your WH&S rules, certainly here in Queensland. Finally, you need to develop your strategic business plan. So your plan needs to be the process that provides your business direction. So you need to be identifying what the goals are for your organisation and breaking those goals down into strategies and detailed action items. Allocate responsibilities and timelines and have the management committee ensure that it keeps each other accountable to achieving those actions to work towards achieving your organisation goals. Your strategic business plan needs to be an evolving document that you need to be revisiting and updating on a regular basis, and you need to see that plan as the blueprint for your business success. As a not-for-profit, if you are going for some larger grant funding programs, at a minimum they will require a business plan supported by financial forecasts. So in your business plan, you need to be defining your organisation purpose. What do you do and why do you do it? What need are you addressing in the community? What's your sustainable competitive advantage? So your sustainable competitive advantage is what makes your not-for-profit organisation different to all of the 700,000 other community organisations that already exist within Australia. Complete a strategic SWOT analysis, develop your path to market, define your goals, make them smart, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic and timely. Develop your action plan and hold each other accountable. Supporting that though, and I can't stress how critical this is, plan your finances. Develop a startup budget. Determine your initial 12-month to 24-month capital commitment and map that out in the form of forecast profit and loss, balance sheet, and more importantly, cash flow statements for that critical first 12 months of training. Calculate your break-even point. So what's your break-even point? It's that point in which you must earn an income level just to cover all of your associated expenses. And you don't start making a profit until such point in time as when your income exceeds that. So know what that break-even point is and identify and monitor your financial and operational key performance indicators. There's some fantastic additional learning modules that are also available through Business Moreton Bay region that I would suggest you familiarise yourself with, and they include things like Small Business Accounting 101, Financial Management for Business Owners or Understanding Financial Literacy, Planning for Business Success. All of those, whilst they are business-related topics, still apply to the not-for-profit world. A not-for-profit organisation, to be successful and sustainable, needs to run with business-like objectives in mind. So please go and make use of those additional resources. And finally, think about how you're going to launch your not-for-profit. How, where, who are you going to invite? Who are your key stakeholders? Who are your key suppliers? Who are your key industry groups? Who are your potential key clients? How are they going to get there? Who's going to be involved in organising it? And then launch. Here is the list of all of the relevant resources that you might find useful as part of your research into setting up a small not-for-profit, or a startup, I should say, not-for-profit organisation. So for anybody considering starting up a not-for-profit, just remember to follow the 10 key steps to start a small business or a small not-for-profit entity. And I wish you all the best and good luck in your successful endeavours. Thank you for listening. Bye.